Hi, my name is Hadley. I'm from the University of Arkansas, and I am incredibly proud to stand in affirmation of today's topic. The United States federal government should ban fracking. Before we get started, I'm just going to give you a little bit of top case in terms of definitions, the weighing mechanism, and a little bit of resolutional analysis before we get started. First off, when it comes to definitions, the USFG is just going to be the United States federal government. Should is going to be an obligation or a duty, aka morally, you ought to. Ban here is going to be officially or illegally prohibit, according to Oxford, and fracking is the pumping of highly pressurized water, sand, and other chemicals into rock formations to create fractures that release trapped oil and gas, according to Vox. Weighing mechanism here is just going to be on balance, so when we look at all the facts presented, if you agree that morally the United States has a duty to ban fracking, you're going to vote for the affirmative. If you disagree, you vote for the negative. Then some resolutional analysis here. Recognize should is a moral obligation. So I'm not presenting you a plan for how we ban fracking. I'm not presenting you a plan for how each state is going to react. Instead, I'm showing you what fracking does, why it's harmful, and why morally we need to do this in order to stop the progression of climate change and the destruction of our environment. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. There are two contentions in today's debate. The first is going to be reliance. Again, reliance. First layer here is going to be oil and gas stops us from switching to green energy. You can just tag it green energy. Let's go ahead and get started. Low oil and gas prices undermine green alternatives. Why is this? Because fracking creates an abundance of oil and natural gas for a few decades. But once that oil and gas runs out, we're back up to the high prices we were already spending before new fracking infrastructure became available. In addition to that, we've run out of the multiple decades we needed in order to successfully switch to green energy before that 2050 deadline of when climate change is no longer reversible. Recognize here that that deadline looms ever closer. If we don't take steps now, we will never be able to stop those massive impacts from drowning our nature, completely ruining our ability to survive on this planet and the future of any of our offspring to survive as well. Let's go ahead and look at the idea that Vox tells us this fracking replaces nuclear energy, but it is not cleaner than nuclear energy. In fact, there's a myriad of problems that come from fracking that my opponent's not going to want you to pay attention to. So let's go ahead and understand why replacing nuclear energy is such a bad idea. When we rely on fracking, we take away money from nuclear plants that need to be built in order to come up with cleaner energy that might not be renewable, but is one of the best ways we have to switch from fossil fuels, coal, and oil onto greener alternatives like energy cells and solar power. So let's go ahead and look at the fact that rainforestaction.net tells us that fracking could unleash a flood of cheap oil and gas, but it is impossible to satisfy domestic oil demand with fracking oil. Prices will inevitably increase again, and we will not have the clean energy infrastructure to maintain our energy demands. Let's look at the second contention here, repercussions. Layer 1 is going to be environment, layer 2 will be humanity. Let's go ahead and look at the idea that methane produces less CO2 when burned, but when it leaks, it traps more than 25% the amount of heat that CO2 does in our atmosphere. Meaning, every time we frack, if we don't follow those procedures perfectly, which we never do, all of that methane gets released into both our water, our aquifers, and our atmosphere. Meaning, we are no longer breathing clean air, we are making our earth hotter, and we are potentially leaving so much chemicals in our water that it is flammable when it comes out of our kitchen sinks. At that point, we've created an issue in which we're not fixing it, we're simply condemning people to live in unhealthy environments. That does not even mention the loss of animal and plant habitats, species declination, migratory disruptions, and land degradation, according to the Yale School of Public Health. We are literally damming our planet in order to create cheap oil and gas that does not even functionally satisfy our demand. You can look at the top 3 states that have banned fracking, which is New York, Vermont, and Maryland. They are not in the top 5 when it comes to energy prices, and they're not in the top 10 when it comes to gas prices. Obviously, fracking does not satisfy our energy demands, or these states would be up at the very top in terms of prices. that point, we recognize the Center for Biodiversity tells us that 25% of those fracking chemicals can cause cancer and are leaking into our aqueducts. The point that I don't want to be drinking what we're pulling out of the ground, and you don't want to either, vote for the affirmative, because we care about what happens when individuals are dying. Thank you.
Cool. 2 minutes on. Everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Begin on my first word. Fantastic speech, but it's crossfire. I gotta have a couple of questions. So we are looking at the morality of the round today, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So whenever we look at are we looking at any kind of implementation at all, or just the broad overview of morality?
What do you mean by that?
Are we looking at any kind of, I know you said not implementing specific policy, but you do recognize that we would have to look at some kind of implementation to look at any kind of morality first, right?
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
I recognize we have to look at some type of implementation, which is why I told you what a ban looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not telling you how we're going to write that into law or how we're going to codify it.
Just
I'm
so we're on
simply
the
saying once it ceases to
that's
exist,
all I needed for
what
that
are the
question.
benefits?
So whenever we're looking at ban, we're looking at getting rid of, we're getting rid of some, if not most, of fracking companies, or what are we looking
Officially,
at?
legally prohibit, according to Oxford.
Right, so we are looking at the dismantleization of these companies, correct?
We're just looking at the official and legal prohibition of fracking.
Right, so if we look at the millions of people that are employed by the fracking industry, is it not immoral to completely remove their job?
What about the millions of people that work for nuclear energy
Please
plants
answer
that
my
are slowly
question.
being taken over by fracking?
Answer my
companies?
question. Is it immoral to completely fire somebody from their job because of a national ban?
No. What is immoral is to make sure that their
That's all I needed
children
from
don't
that
have clean
question.
water.
So whenever you name those 3 states, you named New York, Vermont, and what was the third one?
It was Maryland.
Right, so if you look at the landscape of these states, do they even really have the landscape to frack in the first place?
Yes, they do.
New York has the infrastructure and
I'm not
landscape
talking
to
about
frack.
New York City. I'm talking about New York, the state. It definitely has natural resources to frack.
Okay, and so can you give me any kind of numbers on the importation of oil to these states? Or are they domestically producing enough oil for the state?
I'm telling you, nowhere in the U.S. are we domestically producing enough oil, even with fracking, which means we're importing the vast majority of our oil.
Just to make sure I'm clear on that, you say the USA currently does not domestically support itself with its own oil production.
I'm saying not completely. We still have to import oil, whether or not we
So the
frack.
USA must import oil to continue to be the USA.
They do that in the status quo, yes.
Okay, so how does that get fixed in the AF world?
Can I answer? Perfect. In the app world, right now, those few decades that we'd be relying on fracked oil and fossil fuels, we could instead be focusing on creating a robust green energy economy that solves for our need for oil.
Gotcha, thank you. Six minutes on. Everyone ready to start? All right, just begin whenever I get my timer put down. All right, begin on my first word. Howdy, my name is Austin, representing the University of Arkansas, but I'm even more proud to negate today's resolution. The USFG should ban fracking. Now, quick roadmap, I'm going to go over my opponent's case, go over their definitions, resolutional analysis, can go into their 2 contentions, and then I'll go into my own case, which consists of 2 contentions as well. So, I agree with their definitions, however, I am going to disagree on the little bit of the resolutional analysis of moral obligation. Now, as my opponent admitted in cross, we do have to look at some kind of implementation, or else everything we should think about is a good idea. Morality itself needs some kind of backbone of implementation to see if it is moral in the first place, which is why I asked a question such as job loss leading to immoral decisions. So whenever we look at that, we do have to look at some kind of implementation, have any kind of weight and any kind of evidence in today's round. So let's go into their first contention of reliance. So they talk about oil and gas stops us, how a low price, we have an abundance of oil. So my opponent kind of steps back here. They say, well, we have this abundance of oil. However, the USA can't support itself domestically. They are saying that fracking itself is causing this mass abundance of oil, leading to low gas prices. However, back steps on themselves when they talk about domestically, we can't do it ourselves. I'll talk to that in my own case, how fracking in itself is the dominant domestic pusher, but then again, I'll touch on that in my own case. So they give us this bright line of 2050. How by 2050, the world is going to be, I believe the words were inhabitable. Now, getting rid of fracking right now without any kind of alternative is not going to push back that deadline whatsoever. That deadline is a hard deadline right now, but the affirmation does not solve for that whatsoever. I'll touch on that in my case. So we look at their second contention of repercussions. They talk about methane, how when we follow these regulations, this is just non-unique. But if we look at regulations, how does the AF fix an increase in regulations? If we get rid of fracking and replace it with something, because we're going to have to replace it with something, those regulations that they are following right now are going to be the same ones they're following with the alternate sources of energy, meaning they're going to get broken in the same amount as the fossil industry, meaning to the same amount of leaks to the water supply. So this entire contention is based around failure to follow regulations. However, the AF proposes no idea of how to change these regulations properly. So in the AF world, we are just replacing broken regulations to a broken system. There is no solvency whatsoever with this contention. So let's move on to my case. First contention is going to be called phantom fracking. Second one, phantom fracking. Contention follows: fracking wells make up about half of the total USA crude oil production. That's from the Energy Info admin, and they produce about 102,000 barrels per day. This has been increasing since 2000, so we can see that the USA right now has an abundance reliance on oil. My opponent and I agree on this. The USA has an unhealthy obsession and reliance on oil. Therefore, by completely getting rid and aka banning oils, the USA itself, I read, is not going to be able to deal with the lack of hegemony whenever it comes to oil production as a global producer, which is why we share a subpoint: repercussions. Domestic fracking industry creates somewhere between 2.5 to 11 million jobs domestically. That's from the American Petroleum Institute. And with 95% of new natural gas wells developed ban on fracking, a ban would likely end U.S. global leadership and make America overall weaker and less secure. That's again from the API. So we can see that if we, as the USA, want to continue to be a global superpower when it comes to the production of domestic oil, we are losing this entirely with this official ban. And even if we look at domestic benefits, gas bills have gone down $13 billion from 2007 to 2013 and has earned the USA $9.5 billion in revenue. So we're looking at domestically, we're losing, well, we're going to have to increase in gas bills. We're losing $9.5 billion. We're also losing around 11 million jobs on the maximum. If that's not immoral, I don't know what is. So if we are weighing on balance, these scales are overwhelmingly tipped in the negations balance when you look at money, domestic jobs, and any kind of other substance. So with that, we move on to the second contention: alternatives. So even if the affirmation proposed any kind of alternatives, they don't work. Solar requires absurd amounts of land, disrupts animal habitats, kills hundreds of thousands of birds from the hill. It would also require a policy to be coordinated across multiple stakeholders and have enormous upfront costs. So if they do kind of implement any kind of policy, even if they do offer alternatives, these alternates don't work. We need more time to figure out a proper alternative to fossil fuels, but outright banning them, no matter the moral standpoint, I agree. Fracking has its immoral applications to the environment and to domestic parties. But we cannot simply just say we need to ban it outright because it is bad without looking at the post repercussions, because that 2050 deadline will get a whole lot closer if the USA is overall weaker, less secure, and can't domestically produce its own oil to stay self-sufficient. Subpoint beyond that is going to be intermittent. So if we look at the current producers, we look at the current alternatives of energy, wind and solar, these have just amount of same harms as the fossil fuel industry has on the environment. Wind and solar aren't constantly available, so they're labeled as intermittent. How do we store intermittent energy? Batteries. Batteries, of course, are called SEE flow batteries, so that's from NASA, and also lithium batteries. 98.3% of lithium batteries end up in landfills. That's from climate.gov. So if we look at these alternatives, they don't work. If we look at the fossil fuels industry, this won't work. Now you're probably thinking, this leaves the affirmation with no ground. Wrong. I am saying that we currently do not possess the alternatives we need to switch off of fossil fuels. This leaves the affirmation ground to debate on, but it still leaves the round to flow negation. Because if we immediately ban it with no proper alternative researched or provided, we are just doomed as a nation, and we cannot, the overall impact of the entire negation case is the downfall of the United States. Now you might be thinking, wow, that's an enormous impact. So it's cutting off 11 million jobs domestically, losing billions of dollars a year. The just moral implication of domestically getting rid of crude oil is just immoral, which is why I stand in proud negation and I stand for Crossfire.
Alrighty, fun and ready?
Yep.
Perfect. So first off, naturally great speech, but I do have just a few questions. So when it comes to this idea of we're not able to avoid the repercussions of that 2050 deadline of climate change,
Right.
How much has the US currently done to be a leader in fighting against climate change?
If you're asking me for specific policies in which the U.S. has fought climate change, I can't give you bill numbers. I'm not sure what you're looking for.
That's fine. How much socially have we done to stop climate change?
Again, if you're asking for specific bills or specific things the USA has done, I don't have
Okay,
bill numbers
cool.
on hand.
That's fine. So when this idea of like we have absolutely like no functional alternatives, you mentioned solar and wind. Are those the only two green energy resources that we have?
No.
Okay, what are some other ones?
Yeah, you mentioned in your own case nuclear. I'm sure there's water power, but if
Okay.
we're looking at providing to the same extent as fossil fuels, none of those are proper alternatives.
Okay, cool. And then this idea that if we fix these regulations or we just ban fracking, there are more regulations to be harmed. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in your case, you're talking about that the reason that these are leaking into the aqueducts is lack of regulation, but in your case, you mentioned nowhere how these regulations are being changed. So
Okay.
if we do ban fracking, these regulations aren't getting banned as well, they're just flowing over to
Okay,
another
so
system.
are these regulations just on fracking or are these regulations on all fossil fuels?
You tell me, you're the one who brought up regulations in your case.
Perfect. And then this idea of like fracking does have issues.
Mhm.
What do you think is the biggest issue that comes from fracking?
Probably going to be production of fossil fuels.
What do you mean by that?
Yes, I mean, as I've told you, as you and I both agree on, fracking in itself is not inherently good for the environment.
Okay, cool. So then this idea here that you say like 11 million jobs lost is like super bad. Okay.
Yeah, obviously.
Are we ever going to stop using fossil fuels, coal or oil?
By officially banning them, that's what your goal is.
No, I'm just talking about in the future down the line. Do you see us ever stop using these things?
I can't see into the future, but honestly, I don't think there is a time recently where we can.
Okay, cool, yeah.
Do you want this?
I figured.
Okay, I'm still Hadley Atkinson. I'm still in the affirmative, and I'm still incredibly proud to stand up here today and tell you why we should ban fracking. Let's go ahead and get started. First off, I'm just going to go over the two contentions my opponent gave you, and I'll tag my responses there as we go, and then I'll just rebuild my substantives. We've only got 3 minutes, so let's get started. This first contention here is about like repercussions and how the USA has an unhealthy obsession with fossil fuels and oil. Me and my opponent are in complete agreement here. We do have an unhealthy obsession with oil, and that unhealthy obsession has blinded us to both the impacts and the other opportunities that we have. So let me go ahead and illuminate those for you. In my case, I gave you nuclear energy. And then I told you, what Vox tells you, that these fracking institutions have slowly but surely been taking over nuclear sites, which means not only are we losing one of the best green energy solutions we've found in the last 30 to 40 years, we're also creating more problems for our environment when we don't stop fracking. Then my opponent gives you this relatively problematic statistic here, right? That it's 1.25 to 11 million jobs lost. Judges, audience, I don't know about you, but that's a really big discrepancy in the amount of jobs lost for fossil fuels, especially when we're just talking about fracking. I'm not saying we're suddenly going to stop mining. I'm not saying we're suddenly going to stop drilling. What I'm saying is we're banning fracking because fracking is creating an overabundance of domestic oil that's blinding us to clean energy alternatives we need to cultivate so that we can eventually stop drilling, so that we can eventually stop mining. If we don't do that, we create absolutely no future. My opponent tells you he can't see into the future, and I'm afraid to tell him that's because it's incredibly bleak if we continue to do what we're doing right now. Let's look at this second contention right here, alternatives. My opponent tells you solar disrupts, wind disrupts. When I asked in cross-examination, what are some other types? He tells you nuclear and hydro, two really successful types of green energy that we're cultivating in the US right now, and that fracking is disrupting. Why? It's polluting our oil. Wastewater is completely taken out of the water cycle when used in fracking, which means we don't even have it to power hydro dams. But secondly here, it's taking over and hurting nuclear places. The only way we create a better society is if we have those alternatives. Looking at my first substantium here when it comes to reliance, my opponent misses the nuanced analysis here when I show you that just because the US doesn't produce enough oil to meet all of its domestic needs, fracking creates an influx, allowing us to spend less on that like outward oil, but it doesn't encourage us to increase our domestic green energy production That's why we need to decrease it. But secondly, here when it comes to repercussions, my opponents completely ignore the myriad of repercussions I've told you when it comes to increased earthquakes, when it comes to literal kitchen faucet water being caught on fire, when it comes to actual animals and plants being completely disrupted because we're taking over their habitats. At the point that my opponent fails to recognize these things, you flow to the affirmative.
All right, 5 minutes on. I'm not ready, so I won't ask if y'all are yet. Hold on. Okay. Now are we ready? Wicked. Begin on my first word. Hello again, my name is Austin Keefe, still standing in very proud negation. I only have 5 minutes, so I have a lot to get into. Quick roadmap, I'm going to go over some quick refutation about my opponent's last speech, and then we get into my voters, aka my reasons for decision. So if you look at my opponent's refutations about my case, they talk about the phantom fracking in contention, how we're blinded by the impacts, how nuclear energy is better. Two responses to this. One, they don't give you exactly how nuclear energy is going to compete with the level of fossil fuels can. I mentioned to you time and time again in my case how much we rely on fossil fuels, and they don't talk about how many nuclear power plants we're going to need. They don't talk about how much output is going to need. Now they're probably going to get up here and say, well, I don't need to. It's immoral round. It's immoral to place that kind of burden on the nuclear industry without knowing the exact amount of output it can produce. Second one here, and the biggest one, is going to be titled no link chain. Second one, no link chain. My opponent has provided no exact link chain of how banning fracking is going to immediately result in nuclear provision in energy. They don't talk about how immediately after we ban it, that is going to result in an increase in nuclear energy, an increase in hydro energy. There is no link chain here, so do not flow it to the affirmation, because the government isn't immediately going to pass nuclear energy, and they haven't provided a card or a source that says that they are going to. So this is just kind of hopeful thinking when it comes to the government. Then they talk about the alternatives, how they talk about I named most successful ones, and they talk about earthquakes. Two responses to this. Again, this is going to be no link, talking about how passing this is going to increase regulations, or how is it going to lead to increase in hydro energy. Second one is going to be same broken system, same broken record. So they don't talk about any kind of solutions to the regulation problem. So even if we do switch to these alternatives, which would be fantastic, these same regulations are going to be the downfall of the affirmation. They talk about how we're talking about immorality when it comes to leaking into the aqueducts, or that's my ring, earthquakes. These aren't going to change because the regulations aren't going to change. So the entirety of their cases, the impacts, fall flat without changing regulations because they have no policy in order to do so. So, with 3 minutes, we're going to talk about the voters, aka reasons for decision. First reason is going to be the weighing mechanism on balance. So, we have a scale. We have the affirmation and we have the negation. If you look at the negation sides, we have millions of jobs. My opponent is trying to downplay this. Regardless if you go with the 2.5 or the 11 million, this is millions of jobs, millions of homes that are going to be ruined by losing their income source. So regardless of how you look at it, 2.5 million households or 11 million households are losing thousands of dollars a year because their job is being snapped out of existence. Now, they talked about this in their last speech, how this is going to be an eventual fission out, but the resolution says ban. They talked about how it is the official or legally prohibiting it. You can't slowly prohibit something. You pass a legislation that bans it. They didn't talk about this multi-step process that's going to slowly get rid of jobs, slowly get rid of fracking, slowly get rid of industries. This is a flat-out ban. So the eventual word doesn't mean anything in this round because this is an instant ban of fossil fuel fracking. So that kind of slow progression doesn't matter in the F world. This is an instant ban causing instant job loss, instant billions lost in revenue, and instant loss of US hegemony. So on the negation side of the scale, it is almost 90 degrees because we have billions of dollars, millions of jobs, and domestic hegemony being lost. Now, the affirmation's only kind of impacts are the lack of regulations, which are not changing in the AF world. The affirmation has nothing to tilt this scale. This is a 90-degree angle flowing to the negation. Second reason for decision is going to be morality. Now, this is a moral round. I've touched on this time and time again. If you are the sole breadwinner of your house and you work in the fossil fuel industry, hope you like being homeless because your job is gone, banned, officially prohibited. You are out of a job for who knows how long, because if you are higher up in the fossil fuels industry, you probably have a degree pertaining to the fossil fuels industry, how to run these machines, how to be a mechanic engineer on the wells. Goodbye, you're gone. So you have to figure out where these people are going to go. That is immoral as it gets, people. Not to mention that even my opponent brings up we are somewhat reliant on outside forces when it comes to oil. Now they can take advantage of us. As I stated on my card, we are weaker and less secure overall, leading to other countries. You know how many countries would give a shot of getting hegemonic power over the United States? Are you kidding me? This is going to be overwhelmingly against the United States, domestically and foreignly. Negation flows on both of those points. Now, the last and most important point of reason for decision is going to be regulation. Now, I've touched on this time and time again. I just want this starred, underlined, bold, however you want to do it on the flow. The affirmation has no solvency. The entirety of their impacts is based on leaking into the aqueducts, causing thousands of property damages to the environment, and they quote this all to bad regulation. Affirmation has no plans to change regulation. This is still going to be a problem in the affirmation, which is why you stand firm with me in negation.
Audience ready? Perfect. Opponent ready? Awesome. Again, I'm still Hadley Atkinson, and I've never been more proud to affirm today's resolution, so let's go ahead and get started. In today's speech, I'll be doing two things. First off, explaining this mess up of analysis idea that my opponent just gave you before going into my voters. So let's go ahead and understand why regulation is not the cornerstone my opponent should have based his entire case on. When you ban something, you stop doing it. It doesn't matter how many regulations you put on a dead horse, that dead horse is not getting up and walking again. In this analysis, fracking is the dead horse. When it ceases to exist, it doesn't matter how many regulations you put on it, nobody's fracking, those regulations do not matter. Let me explain something that my opponent obviously missed. Fracking and drilling are two very separate ideas when it comes to the oil industry. Because we're banning fracking, that does not mean that all fossil fuels and all oil and all coal goes away. What it does mean is we get rid of that domestic surplus that the United States has become incredibly reliant on, and we force ourselves to focus on clean energy, to focus on nuclear energy, and to focus on hydro energy alternatives. Why is that so incredibly important? Let me tell you in three voters. The first tier is going to be the climate crisis, the third is going to be the difference, and last is going to be US hegemony internationally. Let's start with the climate crisis. We have a massive, looming burden over us that by 2050, we will not have a planet that is able to sustain us any longer. This doesn't mean we're all going to suddenly die like my opponent wants you to believe. Tag that as fear-mongering. What it does mean is that we are no longer going to be able to reverse the effects of climate change, meaning we have to act now. Ban fracking so that we focus on the nuclear opportunities that we already have cultivated. My opponent's trying to tell you we don't know how much nuclear energy we need to put out. We don't know how many plants we're going to need to build. What he fails to see is the United States already has nuclear power plants. They're already functioning. The problem is that new fracking technologies are infringing on these nuclear properties, meaning they're no longer able to function in exchange for more fracking. That point, you floated the affirmative. Secondly, the difference between fracking and drilling. Listen to the thing I told you in my second speech when I said the idea of having clean energy is to eventually phase out all need for fossil oil and coal. That means fracking's the first to go, and then we can focus on clean energy, so eventually we can get rid of drilling and mining. I told you that verbatim. My opponent does not engage. Last voter here towards the affirmative is going to be US hegemony. The United States needs to do something about climate change if we're this massive leader that my opponent wants you to believe we are. If we continue not to act, if we continue not to take this threat seriously, we cannot expect our allies or individuals who follow us to do so as well. Take the first step towards protecting US interests in the future and vote affirmative. Thank you.